So let me share with you what I'm going to be doing for my pumpkin, and then we're going to switch on over to the sketchbook to think of our design. HB pencil. So what I am doing here is I am creating a general shape composed of short lines, right? These are just straight lines that I am creating, and I'm trying to keep it light because my drawing will be refined and I will be erasing things. I think I'm going to bring this line down a little bit more, give my pumpkin a little bit more height. I'm going to bring this line down a little bit more. So I'm just thinking of the overall kind of oval silhouette of my pumpkin, and I am just laying down a very general blocky shape first. And this is what a lot of artists, you're going to hear them refer to this phase as the block-in phase. And you can see how I'm just using a combination or bringing together short straight lines, and I'm not trying to create perfect curves or laying down a perfect oval right off the bat. And what I am thinking of as well in this part of the process is making sure that my pumpkin is large enough within my drawing space. You don't want your pumpkin to be super small because you're not going to be able to practice the freehand drawing techniques or the watercolor techniques very well if your drawing is super small. Let's go ahead and start actually turning this into a pumpkin. What I like doing is creating a line, or yeah, just a line. And notice I'm also bringing together 3 straight lines when I'm doing this. I'm not creating a curve or drawing super hard or trying to create anything super perfect. Why am I doing this? Because by placing this line, I am understanding the perspective that this pumpkin is going to be viewed from. Because this line, essentially what it is the top central part of the top planes of the pumpkin. Because the stem is going to be coming out of here. And you can do the stem however you want, but I would recommend adding some irregularity and asymmetry to your stem, because this is an organic object. Organic objects are not perfect. They are not perfectly symmetrical. If you make a very straight vertical stem, it can lead to stiffness in your drawing and then later on in your painting as well. So try to make it a little bit curved or crooked in some way, so that your stem can add some sense of asymmetry to your pumpkin. I hope that that makes sense. It's important to know where the stem is actually going to be coming out of before you draw it. And so I find that when I'm drawing things like apples and pears, anything with a stem like that, situating myself with a line before drawing the stem is very helpful. It helps me understand that all of the section here are upper planes of the pumpkin. A lot of people, when they're drawing something like a pumpkin, they do this when they're just getting started. They draw the stem coming out of here like that. It's not wrong. It's just that this is a flat profile view. If you make the stem coming out of the top like this, and we don't see any of the upper planes over here, it leads to flatness. I would always recommend thinking of perspective and at least bringing the stem down a bit from the upper edge of the shape, as opposed to just adding it right along the upper edge. You bring it down so that we can see a little bit of the upper planes of it. Oh, and by the way, you also want to make sure that the bottom of the stem is at least a little bit more wide in circumference down here, and that it is a little bit more narrow as you make your way up in that shape. So for the creases, starting in the middle is going to help, because then you can make your way toward the left and toward the right. I like bringing up a bit of a curve above the line that I initially created, just to create the sense of roundness in this section and to create the sense of overlapping, where this curved part is covering up the bottom of the stem just a teeny tiny bit, bringing up that curve just a little bit and then bringing it down like so. And then you can even bring down the curve a little bit past the initial block in to also convey a little bit more of a sense of this being curved down here. Once you have this All we need to do is make our way toward the left and toward the right. Doesn't really matter what side you like to start with, it's fine. I would recommend adding a little bit of imperfection as you're creating these separate sections. Curve at the bottom, a little bit past my initial block in. Pumpkins are curved objects. If we force straight lines, whether those lines are horizontals or verticals, that is going to lead to flatness. We're going to flatten out the structure of the pumpkin. Okay, so from here, I'm going to do one more complete one coming up from the top. There we go. Bring this one down into a bit of a curve. And then I'm going to make another one over here. I'm going to add a bit of asymmetry. Maybe this one is a little bit more narrow than this one over here. I'm going to bring this one down. We need to start with a solid sketch before getting started with the painting process because the sketch is the foundation for everything that is coming up next. Once you're at this point and you're happy with your pumpkin, this is the point where I want you to bring out your sketchbook, whatever drawing paper it is that you're going to be practicing or planning. I want you to do at least 3 different jack-o'-lantern faces before picking one. You don't have to draw the entire pumpkin, though if you want to just create a very kind of loose, rough shape for the pumpkin, you can go ahead and do that, but you don't even have to draw the shape of the pumpkin. I just want you to plan your little faces. Think of 3 different jack-o'-lantern faces that you can add to your pumpkin. Okay, so for example, one face that comes to mind is something like this, where the eyes are kind of going downward at an angle, and then maybe the nose is a little triangle, and then the mouth, maybe I want to do like a crescent moon. Well, kind of a crescent moon, you know what I mean. And then I could even add some little teeth or something. I don't know, like a vampire type thing. Teeth can be pointy. I've also seen other jack-o'-lantern designs with more rectangular or square looking teeth. I'm going to do another one, and maybe this next one, I want you to think of different designs, okay? Oftentimes we get too narrow-minded and we keep doing the same thing over and over again. But I want you to try to do something different for all 3. Okay, so let's just say that in this one, instead of my eyes going down, maybe they're going in the opposite direction. That's a completely different face. And maybe instead of using more angular shapes, maybe I'm using more curved shapes in this one. So let's just say that maybe in this one, I'm doing something like this. Curved shapes for the eyes. Maybe I do a circle for the nose. And maybe the mouth is more of like an organic shape for this one. Asymmetrical organic shape. Very different type of face. And maybe I even add a little tooth over here. And maybe the tooth is square. And then maybe for my final idea, I do a combination. A quick sketch. So maybe for this one, my eyes are going to be more, it's instead of going down or up, maybe I do more of a triangular, but more of a horizontal at the top, maybe a curve at the back, and maybe even changing the size of your eyes and your mouth also is something that you can use has the opposite. Maybe one of these doesn't even have a nose. Maybe the mouth is, maybe this one doesn't have a nose, and maybe the mouth is so large that it takes up all of this bottom section. And maybe this one has 2 like fangs. So very different faces. By changing the shape and the orientation and the size of the different facial features, you end up with very different faces. This is a great exercise in creativity. It's just fun. When I was in art school, I remember that I had professors ask me to create 20, 30 thumbnails before choosing one. And I remember I used to hate having to spend so long just sketching all of these ideas in my sketchbook, and it was hard to come up with things that looked actually different because, as I said, our brains usually want to do the same thing over and over and over again. But now that I look back, I'm very thankful that my professors had me kind of really try to think outside of the box and think of different ideas before committing to one, because that kind of practice increases your creativity so much as opposed to just going with the first idea that came to mind, which honestly usually it's not going to be your best. Once you have your three, I mean, you can still see what happens if you remove the nose, if you make things a little bit larger, whatever you would like to do. No, I think I like the nose in this one. What would these eyes when this mouth look like? I actually want to see that. This nose with this mouth over here. Ooh, that looks kind of creepier, I think, than the first one. And it depends. If you want your jack-o'-lantern to be cuter, then maybe use more curved facial features. And if you want it to look more spooky, then think of angling the eyes so that it looks mad. It depends if you want it to be spookier or cuter. Whatever is your thing is perfectly fine. Ooh, I like that. And in just a moment, I will tell you how to actually make those facial features look more 3D. Right now, it's just a very rough sketch. I like this one. That's the one that I'm gonna do. I have definitely seen jack-o'-lanterns where the eye is like a crescent, like this is the hole. And those are cuter looking for sure. Circular eyes are going to be more cute than this kind of thing. Now that I have chosen my design, I'm going to place my sketchbook off to the side. I'm going to bring out my watercolor sheet. Make sure that you have your HB pencil. And then we're going to place our facial features that we just designed in our pumpkin. Try to draw lightly. If your eyes are a little bit asymmetrical, it's okay. It's still going to look great because we carve pumpkins by hand. And oftentimes, the things that we do by hand are going to have certain imperfections. I'm going to start with my eyes. Start with a light shape. I think I'm going to make this one a little bit larger. I'm not trying to fit my eyes perfectly in between my lines or anything like that. I'm more so seeing the other eye and trying to get it as close as possible in size to the other eye. Of course, just the shape is going to be flipped or mirrored, which is a hard thing to do. Replicating shapes only flipped is a hard thing to do. Just a basic flat shape for now, but I'll tell you in just a moment how to make these look a little bit more 3D. And then from here, I'm going to do a nose, and my nose, okay, but I'm going to do this. And then from here, I'm going to do the mouth. Sometimes it really helps to create a couple of tick marks for yourself, or what is the height of the shape for the mouth going to be, and even the width. How far out to the left and to the right is the mouth going to be. Create little tick marks and then work inside of that shape. I think I need to bring my nose up a little bit or make it a little bit smaller so that my mouth can be a little bit larger. So I'm going to bring up the nose, make it a little bit smaller than what I had before, bring up my tick mark for the top part of the mouth or the top edge of the mouth shape. And then from here, now that I have my tick marks for my width and my height, I can start adding in the shape for my mouth. So what did I decide on? Okay. This, and then angled down a tiny bit. I think it looks creepier, like it's frowning. And then that. And I'm going to add a couple of little teeth or fangs. Let's bring this down a little. Refining my shape here. You can erase the lines that you no longer need. So I have my general mouth shape, and then I'm going to add a couple of little fangs. Why not? And we're almost done with the sketch. This I can erase as well. Once you're done adding in your mouth, your nose, and your eyes into your pumpkin, all of the facial features look very flat, like a flat shape, whereas the pumpkin does look 3D because we accounted for the roundness of the structure, we accounted for perspective, we were thinking of planes and stuff like that. But the facial features look very flat. So how can we make them look more 3D? The way that we make these facial features look more 3D is exactly the same way that you would add a sense of 3D-ness to the windows when you're drawing a house. It's simply by creating a sense of thickness to the exterior of the pumpkin, to the pumpkin skin. The outer shell of the pumpkin has a certain thickness to it. How do we do that? Well, an easy way to do that is by just creating a bit of a shape inside of that shape that you already created. And that is going to communicate the thickness of the skin that you punched through as you were creating the hole for the eye. If you were seeing this pumpkin, you would be able to see a little bit of that thickness of the exterior of the pumpkin. It looks very flat because you can't see that thickness. The same thing happens when you're drawing a house with windows. Usually, you're going to be able to see a little bit of the thickness of the wall through the window, depending on your vantage point in relation to the window. You're going to see a little bit of the bottom interior plane or the side plane or even the bottom upper plane of the window. I mean, we're creating this from imagination, but because we're making sure to think of form and perspective, we're going to end up with more believable results. Things are going to look less flat. I'm going to do the same thing for this one over here. I'm going to add a little bit of the side plane and a little bit of the lower plane. As we're painting this, we're going to make sure to develop a different value in these areas than here and here so that we can see those interior planes and we can make it look realistic. Now, when it comes to the nose, I'm going to just add a bit of the bottom plane here. And then for the mouth, because the mouth is even lower to the ground, I'm going to add a little bit of the bottom plane over here. We would see the thickness of the shell down here and here as well on the sides. If you would like to add an extra line to convey a bit of a lid, all you need to do is, hold on, let me grab my HB pencil. You would do something like this. You can make it a little bit wider in circumference if you'd like. And that would be added as a final detail into the piece. Just a very, very like a subtle brushstroke to convey a bit of that separation, if you will. I'm going to be using 6 different colors for this piece. For my oranges throughout the pumpkin, I'm going to be using my lemon yellow, which is a cool yellow. And my lemon yellow looks like this. It's very important that when we're working with watercolor, we don't go too dark too fast, and we're accounting for the light. And we want to make this jack-o'-lantern look like it's glowing. So it's going to be very important to use a bright, cool yellow as the base kind of foundation color. And then we're going to be building on that. And then I'm going to be using a warmer yellow. And this is going to be Azo Yellow Deep for me. Warm yellow is going to look more like it's leaning toward the orange side, more like a mustardy yellow color. See the difference there? The warm yellow is not only darker than this cooler yellow, but it's also more orange. So aside from these, the other color that I'm going to be using in my pumpkin for my oranges is this permanent red light, which is my warm red that I have right here in this palette. Permanent red light, let me swatch it out for you on its own, looks like this. It's leaning a little bit more towards the orange side of the spectrum, not too much the magenta or purple side of the spectrum, which that would be a cool red. This is a warm red. And then the last color that I'm going to be using in the pumpkin is burnt sienna. Burnt sienna is a reddish brown, and I'm just going to be using the burnt sienna for darker value areas in the pumpkin. So in creases, maybe just at the end to convey a little bit of that separation between the lid and the bulk of the pumpkin. That is where I'm going to be using the burnt sienna. And then finally, I'm going to be bringing in some browns for the stem. And if I want to add a little bit of a cast shadow at the end, I can also use browns. So burnt sienna is going to be repeated in the stem. But aside from the burnt sienna, I'm going to be using a bit of yellow ochre for the stem. Yellow ochre looks like this. If you have raw sienna is a very similar color to yellow ochre. And then finally, I'm also going to be bringing in my darker brown, which is burnt umber. Burnt umber can be replaced with sepia, Van Dyke brown, Mars brown. Any darker brown like that will do just fine. It's a darker, more chocolatey brown. And that's all. This is all I'm going to be using. Now let me explain how I'm going to be developing the values in the pumpkin. These four colors are the ones that I'm going to be using for the pumpkin. The cool yellow, the warm red, and this reddish brown. When I am choosing my colors that I'm going to be painting something with, I always think not only of color, but of value, because value, also known as tone, is number one when it comes to developing a sense of realism and depth. It's value or tone is even more important than color correctness when you're trying to develop a sense of depth. If you're thinking of lights and shadows and midtones, and you're thinking of the 3D-ness and how light is hitting the subject and developing lighter areas and midtone areas and darkest areas, that is more important for creating a sense of 3D-ness and depth. If value is that important, you need to think of what colors you're going to be bringing in to develop those highlights and midtones and darks before jumping in. This is why these four colors are excellent, because I have a very light color and I have darker colors that I can add to these to create that range of values that I need. I have a very light color and I have a darker color. So I can get a nice range here. Now, how am I going to create the darker oranges? We're always working from lights to darks when we're working with watercolor, right? Almost all of us. First, we're going to start with these two colors in layer number one, because we're just thinking of developing those lighter values in layer one. We're going to dry that. And then in layer two, that is when we start creating more of a base orange local color for the pumpkin. And for that base orange, more of the midtones, they're gonna be created with these two colors. When you're working on that second and third layer in the pumpkin, be very, very careful. Don't add too much red into your warm yellow, because you don't want your pumpkin to start turning red. When I'm working on that second layer in the pumpkin, you're going to see me start adding a little bit of my permanent red light into my warm yellow to create a nice orange. Red, if you're looking for an even darker value, add more red into it and you're going to get a darker value. That doesn't look darker because I didn't add too much red. But don't add so much red that it starts turning super red, because we don't want a red pumpkin. We just want a darker orange. So make sure that when we're working on that second layer, you don't add too much red into your yellow to the point that it starts turning more of a red than an orange. With my lemon yellow, my azo yellow deep, and my permanent red light, I can create a very nice range of colors or values, throughout my pumpkin. When I am ready to take it even darker, especially in the creases and things like that, that is when I'm going to start adding in burnt sienna into this orange to darken those shadow areas even more. So the burnt sienna is going to be the darkest color that I'm going to be using in the pumpkin. So as you can see, little by little, I'm adding the second darker color, and then the third darker color. And then finally, I'm going with just the burnt sienna at the end. It's all about thinking of it gradually. What color are you going to be adding next to darken it a step further? Then what color are you going to be adding into that to darken it a little bit more? The consistency is also important because the thicker you get with your color, the darker it's going to look. When we're working with this medium, there are two things that we are constantly shifting and changing along the way. One of them is the color to color ratio as we are developing our different color mixtures for those different values, but it's also the consistency of our colors on our palette. Right? Sometimes we're using more watered down paint when we're looking for paler color, and other times we're adding more of that paint into the mixture if we're looking for a deeper, darker color. Usually, I work between tea consistency in those first layers. Then I work with more of a coffee consistency, which I would see this more as a coffee consistency right here on my palette. And then until the very, very end, I use more of a milk consistency. I never really use cream consistency. At the very end, when I'm pushing darkest shadow shapes, that's when I go in with a bit of a thicker consistency. Usually, I'm somewhere between tea just in the very beginning and coffee as I make my way through the process. And for the stems, it's going to be exactly the same thing. We're just going to be starting with the lightest color, which is for me, the yellow ochre. And we're going to be gradually building on the lightest color, first with the burnt sienna, which is the medium brown, and finally with the burnt umber, which is the darkest brown. I'm going to change my water because it's looking very orange, and we'll get started with layer 1 in the pumpkin, okay? Okay, so I'm going to use the size 14 round brush for the first part of this process, and then I'm going to be getting a little bit smaller. I'm going to be using this size 8. Add some of my lemon yellow right here on my palette. I'm going to push this away. Push this color out of the way here. I just want to go in with lemon yellow first. And for this initial part of the process, I will be adding plenty of water into my color because what I am using or what I'm going for is very, very pale color. All right. So I'm going with a tea consistency. There's a lot of movement here on my palette. It's very, very watered down. I'm looking for pale color right now. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be painting that first layer of very, very pale color all throughout the pumpkin, except for the stem and the facial features. So I want you to work intentionally but quickly, okay? Because we're filling in a pretty large area and we're working around the facial features simultaneously with a good size brush. I'm using a size 14, and this brush, it's very cheap, but it's very absorbent. It allows me to load up a good amount of this watered down paint in my bristles so that I can go in and paint this area nice and quick. If you try to go in right now with a very small brush, you're going to have issues because you're going to have to reload over and over and over again. And every time you stop and reload, your paint is already starting to dry on your paper. So make sure that you're using a good sized brush that is absorbent, that allows you to absorb a good amount of water in your bristles. And you can make your way from left to right or right to left, downward, whatever is easiest for you. But what you're going to do is you're going to start filling up the entire pumpkin shape, except for the eyes, the stem, the nose, and the mouth. And what I want you to notice is how I'm continuing to come back to the place where I started to re-wet that area over and over again instead of just making my way toward the opposite edge or side once. Because if you do that, by the time you reach the opposite edge, that place where you started is already going to be dry. Dry paper is thirsty paper, and it's going to absorb that paint immediately when it is placed on it. So continue coming back to where you started to re-wet that area and then make your way further to the right or the left a little bit more, and then come back to where you started. Make your way further down a little bit more, come back to where you started, make your way further down, and so on and so forth. You should know that when I am starting with a painting, I always turn off fans. I don't have a heating system on or even air conditioning unit on, because all of those things, and even your climate, the weather that you live in, all of those things are going to have an impact on how quickly or how slowly your paint starts drying on you. Okay, so always keep those things in mind, because those things may be making the painting process harder for you, and you think it's your skill level, but it's actually just the environment that is not, you're not taking into account the environment that you're working in or the things around you, and they're just making everything more difficult. Okay, so here you can see how I'm continuing to run my paintbrush bristles over everything over and over again. I'm laying down this first palest color and simultaneously pre-wetting this entire area, because by doing the pre-wetting, I can ensure that I'm going to be left with soft effects in this initial layer. Okay, so I'm almost done here, and if you kind of shift down in your chair a little bit and you see your painting against the light, you'll see an even glistening, yellow glistening, of course, because we're already painting in color, all throughout this area. I want you to see that even glistening all throughout this shape. If you don't see that even glistening, it means certain sections of your paper are already starting to dry, and you need to work on, of course, if you're not using quality paper, that can also be the reason. If things are already starting to dry, I would recommend working on your pre-wetting technique and painting faster and loading up your paintbrush well. You can see that even glistening all throughout this area. And I haven't rushed my process. I took my time with this first palest layer. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start adding more of my Azo Yellow Deep into the lemon yellow. And I'm going to start adding this into the creases, the bottom planes, anywhere that I want to darken, and start pushing a little bit more of a mid-tone, right? Because again, thinking of this in values. So we started with our lightest value, which is created with the lemon yellow, cool yellow. And then now I'm moving forward into the midtones, lighter midtones, then darker midtones, then darkest darks. But in this first layer, remember, we're just doing the lightest values, okay? Going in with a little bit more of my Azo Yellow Deep, just into the creases now, and into the planes that are facing away from the light. I want to leave my lemon yellow shining through. And by the way, now I'm going in with a bit more of a coffee consistency, because my lightest color is already in. So I can start getting a little bit thicker with my consistency. Okay. But notice how I'm just placing this my warm yellow in the creases and the planes that are facing away from the light. So the bottom sections of the pumpkins that are curving down and in, maybe a little bit in this separation where the lid is, the separation between the lid and the bulk of the pumpkin. You can also start developing a little bit of a mid-tone there. But you don't want to cover up all of the lightest yellow. You want to leave the lightest yellow visible on its own in those sections that are curving out. So that right there is enough for that first layer in the pumpkin. I don't want to continue darkening too much in this first layer. It could get too dark too fast. I don't want to do that. I want my first layer to stay within the lighter values. But I do want to paint the stem. So for the stem, I'm going to be switching on over to my size 8 round brush. For the stem, I'm going to be going in with my yellow ochre first, which is my lightest brown or neutral that I'm going to be using in the stem. So going in with my yellow ochre and just starting to paint in the stem, making my way up. The stem, we will develop a little bit of a wood texture in the stem. I embrace little bleeds that happen, especially in this first layer. So if I'm painting in these browns in the stem, I get a little bit of bleeding at the bottom and my yellow ochre starts bleeding into the orange or yellows. I embrace that. That actually looks beautiful. I like how it looks. So I paint that first layer in the stem. You can even see how I'm leaving little sections of paper unpainted. That is going to help me develop a little bit of a wood texture. And now I'm going to add some burnt sienna, which is the reddish brown, into the yellow ochre to darken it. And with this color, I'm going to be just dropping it in into darker areas that I'm looking to push a little bit more. Once again, not trying to cover up the initial color, but just looking to develop a range of values in the stem. So where would darker values be? And you can always feel free to use the clean and only slightly damp bristles of your paintbrush to do a little bit of lifting if you need to. So if you need to go in and absorb some paint to lighten areas back up, as long as the paint is still wet, you're going to be able to do that. And even if you can't lift up all of the color that you've placed on your paper, you're going to be able to lift up some. Okay, so my stem is still wet. I'm going to go in and drop in just a tiny bit of my burnt umber, just a bit. I'm not really trying to go into the very dark values right now, but since everything is still wet and workable, I can just add a tiny bit of burnt umber already, just here and there. If you want more of a gradual transition, you can just add the burnt umber into your brown color mixture over here to darken it just a little bit more, and then use it in that way. Instead of going right in with the burnt umber straight away, you can create a bridge tone. So the last thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to start painting in the facial features. Because I took my time with the pre-wetting process with that first yellow layer, look at that. I still have everything glistening down here. So this means that if I go in and start painting my eyes, my nose, my mouth, the colors that I use in these shapes are going to start bleeding into the oranges because watercolor is always going to expand when placed on paper that is wet. If we do this right now, we have to be very, very careful. I would actually switch to a smaller brush. And maybe for you, your paper is already dry, in which case you don't have to be as careful. I don't want to have any backruns happening either, backruns happen when you go in with too much water on paper that it's partially damp. So when you go in with too much water in your paintbrush on paper that is already starting to dry, that's when you get backruns because the water falls down the bristles of your paintbrush and disturbs that paint that is partially dry, and you get these splotches. I'm going to go ahead and start painting in my facial features with my size 0 round brush. So we want this pumpkin to look, or jack-o'-lantern to look like it has light inside. And so we're going to be using the lightest colors, so a lot of the lemon yellow and a little bit of the warm yellow as well, in the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. What I'm going to do is take some of my lemon yellow. Both of these colors that I'm going to be using in the facial features, I'm going to be using them inside of the facial features and outside. They're going to get a little bit lost. But when we develop the second layer throughout the pumpkin with those darker values, there is going to be a difference, okay? Watering down my lemon yellow, and I'm going to start painting in the features. Paint in that interior plane as well. the one that adds depth to the features. Paint that in. I'm very careful because my paint is still wet around it. I'm going to add a little bit of my Azo Yellow Deep into the yellow, and I'm just going to drop it into the edges of the eye. And that's it. That's all I'm going to do. I'm going to move on to the next eye. First going in with my lemon yellow. And then going in with a tiny bit of my Azo Yellow Deep, especially along the edges, dropping it in so that I get a soft effect. I'm going to paint in this shade quickly. Painting in the mouth with my lemon yellow first. So lemon yellow and a bit of my warmer yellow. So in my first layer, I'm just doing the lighter values. So I'm going to hit this with my hair dryer because this needs to be completely dry before moving on to layer number 2. Okay. Right now, it's partially damp. I definitely don't want to start working over this because it's very easy to overwork watercolor. Now that we're in layer number 2, we're going to start with the midtones, and this is when we start bringing in the red. So whatever warm red it is that you chose, which for me it's going to be permanent red light. It looks like this. Remember what I mentioned before, don't add too much red into your yellow because we don't want a red pumpkin. Add just enough that it starts turning into a secondary orange, and so that we're able to develop even darker values than what we already have. Remember that we're making our way incrementally towards darker values, right? So I should definitely switch on over to working with my smaller brush because I'm going to work section by section now. So I'm going to add more of my Azo Yellow Deep into my palette. And I'm going to add a little bit of my permanent red light into my Azo Yellow Deep. And you can even test this out on one of your scrap pieces of watercolor paper to see if you get a secondary orange. That looks pretty good to me. Okay, it doesn't look super red. It looks like an excellent transition tone between what I already have and the next values that I'm going to be developing, right? You don't want to go too dark or too red. Think of the next transition step. And then as you go, you add a little bit more red into it if you want to darken it even further. But be careful not to add too much red because you don't want your pumpkin to start turning red. So from here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to work section by section now, bit by bit. So curved section by curved section, okay? And what's important is you're not covering up the lightest value areas. You're just overlapping color in darker value areas that you're looking to push more. So for example, this is a crease, right? And we know that the creases go in. So there would be a shadow area in the crease. So I'm going to darken that area, remove that color from my paintbrush bristles, remove that excess water, and soften the inner edge, right? Deepening the shadows in that section, pushing the contrast and adding more of a sense of realism. I didn't cover up this section over here because that would be the middle of that curved part that is coming toward the light. I'm just looking to darken the crease. So another example, this is the crease right here. I darkened the crease. I'm going to darken this section of the crease down here, maybe even a bit of the lower plane. This is the crease. I'm going to paint over this. I should have painted this as well. Okay, that's the crease. Removing that paint from my paintbrush bristles, removing that excess water, softening the inner edge, softening this, right? You can add a little bit more color into the crease while that is still wet, if you want to. Notice how I am expanding that range of values by darkening or pushing the shadow areas. And I'm leaving the curved section that is coming up and catching more light. I'm leaving that with just the first layer shining through. I'm going to do the same thing with the secondary orange in all of my sections of my pumpkin. Take time to check on your secondary color mixture before going in with a mixture that is way too red. Okay? That's why having scrap pieces of watercolor paper on hand is so helpful. Painting in a little abstract shadow shape in this crease. And I want to encourage you to see these shapes that you are painting as abstract, irregular shadow shapes and not as lines. Because what you're painting are shadow shapes, not lines. And there are no lines in realism. Going in these creases. Notice how I'm not covering up what I don't have to cover up. I'm just overlapping my color in shadow areas. And just pick a side along your line that you created in pencil and paint along that side. Softening the inner edge, softening, softening. Adding more Azo Yellow Deep into my palette, adding a little bit of my permanent red light. I'm going to add a little bit of this shadow color down here in the planes opposite to the light. Removing that color from my paintbrush bristles, removing that excess water, softening the edge that I'm looking to soften by just running my paintbrush bristles over that edge. Making my way toward the right, section by section. Painting right along one of my lines here. Painting over here. Removing that paint from my paintbrush bristles, removing that excess water, and softening the inner edge. Okay, adding a little bit more permanent red light into my yellow. Test your colors if you need to before going in. I would consider this a coffee consistency that I'm going in with. It's not very thick. I'm still thinking of these as mid-tones, not my darkest darks. The darkest darks will be added with a third layer. So we're going to be developing even more contrast and adding a pop and realism to the pumpkin with a third layer. Okay? This is still the second layer. Removing that excess water, removing paint, softening the inner edge. If you want to take it a tiny bit darker, add a little bit more red into your yellow. Pop it in. Just be gradual about it. Okay? Don't go too dark too fast, because if you do that, it's going to look very stark. Your shadow shape is going to be too stark looking, too distracting. And remember to see these as abstract, irregular shadow shapes, okay? Not lines. And a little tip for you is press down your paintbrush bristles a little bit more, a little bit less as you're painting in that shadow shape. And that is going to help you create irregularity throughout that shape. Okay. So I've darkened along the creases. What I'm going to do now is darken a little bit of the line right here for the lid. So adding a little bit of red into my yellow. That's too light. I'm going to add a little bit more red because I can't even see it when I place it. See how I'm pressing down a little bit, then lifting my paintbrush, pressing down. That is going to help me create an irregular looking shape. Sometimes the shape kind of disappears. Other times it's a little bit thicker and more visible. That is also going to make things look more natural. Losing some of those edges makes things look a little bit more realistic. So as I've been making my way toward the right, this section is already pretty dry. And what I've done is I've darkened along the side of one of my pencil lines, right? I need to darken the opposite side now because it's a crease. So it goes in and then up again. And I've just darkened one side along my pencil lines. So I want to darken the other side. It doesn't matter which side you darkened, just do the same thing, but in the opposite side now. If I darkened along the left, I'm now going to do the same thing, but along the right. And over here, I also darkened along the left, so I'm going to do the same thing along the right. Same thing here. Skipping over those facial features. Darkening along the right. Keeping plenty of that first layer shining through unpainted in the center of the curve. Okay, that's it. I'm just going to darken a little bit along the edges of my features, just a little bit. I'm not trying to outline the features, but I just want to create some shadow shapes here and there along some of these. I'm going to switch on over to a smaller brush. Just creating some shadow shapes to define my features here and there just a little bit. Here at the bottom. All right, that's it for now. That's all I'm going to do. Notice how I didn't try to outline all around my features. All I created was little shadow shapes along some of these edges to start bringing a little bit of definition and contrast to the features. Okay, so I'm going to push dark areas in the stem. If you remember, in the stem, we went in with three colors, the yellow ochre, the burnt sienna, and finally the burnt umber. Because we already have the lightest values in, really I just need the darker two. So the burnt sienna and the burnt umber. I no longer need the yellow ochre because it's already in and I'm not going to be covering it up or anything. So I'm going to go in with my size 4 round brush and my burnt sienna. And I'm just going to be darkening certain little sections in the stem. I'm going to use upward flicking motions to create a little bit of a sense of texture as I am developing slightly darker values. Just kind of with a scribbling motion almost. And then finally going in with the burnt umber. burnt umber, adding burnt umber into the mix. And darkening certain sections a little bit more. Doing those little up and down motions to create a little sense of wood texture. I don't want to overly describe this texture and make it too overwhelming for the viewer, too distracting. So if you notice that you go in with very visible lines and marks, you may want to soften some of those edges with a clean and slightly damp brush. You can always go back to a lighter brown if you want to after making your way through that sequence. All right, cool. I'm all done with layer number 2. I now want this layer to dry completely because I'm going to go in with layer number 3, which is going to be creating the darkest darks. So my painting is not as wet as it was before. I didn't bring in a lot of water like I did with the first layer where I was really looking for soft wet on wet effects. I painted the second layer wet on dry. As I was painting, things were drying pretty quickly, but I do want to make sure that everything is completely dry nonetheless before getting started with my final layer. So I'm going to hit it with my hair dryer just for a bit, and then we can get started with the final layer. And I'm going to go in with my third and final layer, and we're also going to be darkening the inner plane of the features. Let's start with the inner plane of the features before doing the darkest darks throughout the exterior of the pumpkin. I'm going to paint in those small shapes, which remember it's the thickness of the skin, of the exterior skin. I want to make those interior planes a little bit darker than the innermost part of the pumpkin where the light is. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my warm yellow. I'm going to use the warm yellow to paint that in. Make that visible. And then I'm going to add just a tiny bit of red into it. And I'm going to pop in a little bit of red orange into certain sections of that little shape for a little bit of color and value variation in that inner plane. So now we can more clearly understand what is the inner plane and what is the actual interior of the pumpkin, because I darkened that inner plane. I'm going to do the same thing with my other inner planes, starting with my warm yellow. So going in with the warm yellow and taking a little bit of my red, adding it to the warm yellow, and dropping it in. And then going in with my warm yellow again, which is this Azo Yellow Deep. Painting in this bottom plane of the mouth, whatever planes it is that you've added into your drawing for those interior planes. Paint that in with your warm yellow. Add a little bit of red into the warm yellow. And then just drop it in while that warm yellow is still wet, and you're going to get those soft effects and a nice variation in both hue and value in this inner plane. And that's it. Now we can work on the final pushing of darkest darks throughout the pumpkin itself. And this, my friends, is when we bring in the burnt sienna. Remember how when I was explaining this in the beginning, I was explaining how these 4 colors are the ones that we're going to be using to develop the range of values that we need in the pumpkin. So far, we've used 3. We need to push darker areas a little bit more for a little bit more pop, a little bit more realism. And the color that we're going to be using for that is burnt sienna. If your painting is still not showing a good range of mid-tones, I would not recommend going in with the burnt sienna yet. Maybe you still need a bit of a transition step before getting into the darkest color. If you just have very light values throughout your pumpkin right now, and you go in with the burnt sienna, it's probably going to look a little bit too dark and too stark. So if that's the case for you, what I would recommend doing is working in 4 layers instead of 3. There is no right or wrong in terms of amount of layers to work in when you're working with this medium. You could be working in 10 layers if you want to. You need to allow each layer to dry completely before moving on to the next. Otherwise, the more layering you do, the more chances of overworking your piece. But this is all to say, if you need to work on a second layer before getting into the deepest, darkest tones or values, go ahead and do that. And then you can do a 4th layer with your burnt sienna. Another thing that you could do is combine your warm yellow with burnt sienna before going in with the burnt sienna, which I'm going to do that myself because I'm always looking to go gradually into the darker values. So you could do your warm yellow, which for me is Azo Yellow Deep, add some burnt sienna into this to darken it a little bit more. And then, by the way, I'm using my size 8 round brush for this. And then with this darker color, you're going to go into the creases. And we're just going to go into the creases once this time. So I'm painting over the line kind of right in the middle, if you will. See how I took it a step darker? Seeing these as abstract, irregular shadow shapes, and sometimes, this is very important, sometimes I'm not even connecting my line. So I'm not trying to go top all the way to the bottom with one consistent line. Sometimes I'm painting in a shape up here. I skip a little section and I go again and skip and go again and skip and go again. That is going to help you not stay away from the look of lines. And as you're drawing these final shadow shapes in, if you want to go in and soften edges, you can definitely do that. But you don't have to soften everything. You can always, and I love doing this in my own painting. I'm always thinking of how I can incorporate or combine soft transitions with harder edges. I'm going to remove this paint from my paintbrush bristles, remove this excess water, and maybe soften some sections of these shapes here and there. Continuing with the back lines over here. Adding a little bit more burnt sienna into the warm yellow. Darkening some sections just here and there over these lines. We're going to do a final wash in just a bit to add a final integration of values. We'll talk about that in just a bit. And fix this little line here. I'm going to switch on over to my smaller brush. This is my size 4 round brush. And I'm going to do a little bit more definition along the features. So again, I'm not trying to draw a line or paint a line. I'm just defining edges a little bit here and there. For my shadow for this one, I'm going to be using Burnt Umber, which is my darker brown. And I'm going to be dropping in some blooms into the shadow because it adds a little bit of interest to the shadow, I think. Oh, I also want to show you how to do a little bit of final splattering because it can add some nice texture to the pumpkin. Prepare a good amount of your darker brown that you're using, whatever it is that you're using. Coffee consistency, that's too watered down. Coffee consistency a good sized brush. This is a size 14 brush. And pick a side that you want your shadow to be in. And if you want to sketch it in, you can. Hold on, where's my, oh, here it is. If you want to sketch in your shadow before painting it in, that's perfectly fine as well. I'm going to sketch my shadow on the right side. This means that the light is hitting this pumpkin from the upper right. Once you have decided on where your cast shadow is going to be, just go in and paint the shape with your brown. I'm going to be dropping in a little bit of yellow into the shadow to make it more interesting and colorful. Maybe a little bit of my lemon yellow. Little blooms. Can even add a little bit of a sense of a surface in the bottom there so that the shape is not just on the right. Have a little bit of a shadow effect down here as well. Okay, so the last thing that I'm going to finish up with is a bit of a wash. Make my shadow a little bit longer here so that it connects with the side. Okay. Finally, I'm going to finish up with a bit of a wash. This is optional, but sometimes I like doing it at the end of the painting process. And I'm just going to be adding this very loose, quick wash in the exterior of the pumpkin, not the facial features. So I'm going to hit this one last time with my hairdryer because I don't want to be creating this wash on wet paint. You can leave your pumpkin as is. You don't need to do this. This is just a final wash that I sometimes like adding in because it helps me unify the piece, brighten up certain areas, do final darkening of shadow areas or planes opposite to the light. And this is kind of a mid-tone wash, so I'm not going too dark with it. So when it comes to this piece, the colors that I use for my mid-tone were mostly the Azo Yellow Deep, my warm yellow. What I'm going to do with this one, maybe I'm going to add a little bit of red into it in just a bit. But coffee consistency, loose, size 14 round brush, and I'm just going to go in and intensify certain areas with this color. Notice how I'm not covering everything up. I'm just going into sometimes in between the darker value areas and the lighter value areas to create a little bit of a bridge transition. A bridge tone in between, which softens the look of the darker areas. Okay. I'm going to add a little bit of my permanent red light into the yellow, the warm yellow that I was just using. And I'm going to darken a little bit of the sides of the pumpkin on this side, which are opposite to the light, because I just decided a moment ago that my light was going to be hitting this pumpkin from the upper left, right? Because my cast shadow is on the lower right, opposite to the light source. So if that is the case, then that means that these planes over here are catching less light than the planes over here. So that is why I'm just darkening them a little bit more. This is very loose. Okay, I don't want to darken anything else because I'm going to get rid of the glowing effect. What was the color of the last wash? The color of the last wash was a mixture of my Azo Yellow Deep, which is my warm yellow, and a tiny, tiny bit of the permanent red light. But it's just added here and there in a pretty watered down state, Suzanne. So you're not trying to cover up everything. You're just trying to add a little bit of a mid-tone wherever you need to, just wherever you need to. If you, for example, have areas where your darkest shadows look very contrasting against the very light values beside those shadows, it's helpful to add in a quick wash, larger shape kind of on top of it and around it, because that larger wash is going to help create a mid-tone transition between the darker shadow shapes and the lighter values, and it's going to help make the shadow shapes less stark looking. And of course you can also add a bit more of a shadow on the opposite side of the light, opposite to the light, right? So wherever you decided to add in your cast shadow, you can go in with that loose final wash and just create some larger shapes in some of these sections of the pumpkin, so that you can really convey that the shadows, like all of this, the side of the pumpkin is in shadows, and this half of the pumpkin is catching more light from whatever light source, the moon, a street lamp, that kind of thing that could be illuminating the pumpkin. This last wash I sometimes use to just unify the piece and brighten up areas even. I use this wash, for example, whenever I want a color to appear very, very bright. I sometimes go in with this last wash and create just a quick layer of that base color for that area. You do want to be very light-handed with that final wash because you don't want to darken areas that don't need to be darkened again. You need that range of values if you want your painting to convey any sort of depth. And if you cover up the lighter values, you're going to be flattening everything out. If I have just somewhat of a budget to spend on watercolor supplies, it's going to go on the paper, on making sure that I'm buying quality paper. Because as long as you're using quality paper, your paint can be student grade and you're going to end up with great results as long as it's quality student grade paint. And to be honest, these paintbrushes that I use today and the majority of the ones that I have in my studio are pretty cheap brushes. This one I've had for years and it was $5 or something like that, something ridiculous like that. Royal and Langnickel Zen line watercolor brush. All of my paintbrushes are synthetics and they are incredibly affordable and I'm still able to arrive at pretty great results. But if the paper is bad, the results are not going to be super good. Of course, I have paper that is not 100% cotton in my studio. I have sketchbooks that I work in where the paper is wood pulp paper. It's not 100% cotton. I firmly believe that in order to stay consistent, you need to have both accessible supplies and higher level supplies, especially for projects that you're spending more time on. Whenever you're selling a piece or creating a commission or something like that, you do want to make sure that you're using the highest quality supplies so that you are giving someone the highest quality painting that is going to last a long time. But in order to stay consistent, you want a combination, right? Sometimes you're going to be creating quick studies, color studies, quicker work on paper that is not 100% cotton. I am currently working on a sketchbook project. I don't know if you've seen any of the videos where I'm sharing this personal sketchbook project that I'm working on, which is mixed media. That is not 100% cotton paper. The objective of that sketchbook project is not really creating perfect watercolor pieces. It's more so exploring and mixing line and wash via colored pencil and watercolor. It's a different objective. I really think that unless you have a ton of cash, right, to spend on art supplies, if so, more power to you, get whatever you want. For most people, I would say that making sure that you have a combination of accessible supplies and higher quality supplies is going to allow you to stay consistent, because this way you won't feel guilty for wasting super expensive paper and whatnot, and you'll be able to paint more because you don't have that guilt or that sense of responsibility hanging over you that you need to create something perfect with those super expensive supplies. So that's just my stance on this. Happy Halloween for those of you celebrating. Enjoy the season. Thanks so much. Take good care and enjoy your art practice. See you soon.